Once upon a time, in a small village called Oko, lived a young man named Jide. He had just finished university and was sent to the village for his national youth service. Jide was tall, handsome, and full of energy. Everyone in the village was excited to see him, especially the young girls who couldn't stop whispering about how handsome he was. Jide was assigned to teach at the only school in the village. His job was to teach English and mathematics. On his first day in the classroom, all the girls couldn't take their eyes off him. They would giggle, write him notes, and smile whenever he spoke. At first, Jide tried to focus on teaching, but soon, the attention from the girls became too much to ignore. One day after class, a girl named Amaka stayed behind. Amaka was the most beautiful girl in the village, and she was always the first to greet Jide in the morning. She asked Jide if he could give her extra lessons in English because she wanted to be the best student in the class. Jide, thinking it was an innocent request, agreed. Amaka came to Jide's house for extra lessons. The more time they spent together, the closer they became. Soon, Amaka began to visit Jide every day, not just for lessons, but to talk about everything. One evening, when the sun was setting and the air was cool, Jide and Amaka sat outside Jide's house, talking about life in the village. As the stars started to fill the sky, something unexpected happened. They kissed. Jide knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop. They spent more time together in secret, and before long, Amaka became pregnant. The news spread quickly and the village began to whisper. Jide tried to hide from the stairs, but things only got worse. More girls started visiting Jide's house asking for extra lessons. One of them, Nkechi, was shy and quiet, but she had always admired Jide from afar. Jide, feeling lonely and trapped by what had happened with Amaka, didn't know how to say no. Soon, Nkechi was also visiting Jide regularly. Before long, the same thing that happened with Amaka happened with Nkechi. She too became pregnant. The village was in chaos. The elders called a meeting to talk about Jide. Mothers were worried about their daughters. Fathers were angry. The daughters kept quiet, not wanting to bring shame to their families, but everyone knew what was happening. Jide, once the pride of the village, was now the center of a growing storm. He tried to keep his secret life hidden, but the truth kept slipping out. One by one, the girls in the village started showing signs of pregnancy. Each time Jide thought he could escape the consequences, something new would come up, pulling him deeper into trouble. As the months passed, the situation became unbearable. Parents started pulling their daughters out of school, but the damage was already done. Jide was no longer the admired teacher. He was now the man responsible for the growing number of pregnant girls in the village. The village chief, a wise old man named Chief Eze, was furious. He called Jide to his hut and said, "Young man, what have you done? Do you not see the mess you've caused in this village?" Jide, ashamed and scared, didn't know what to say. Chief Eze gave him an ultimatum: fix the situation or face banishment from the village. Jide was torn. He didn't know how to fix anything. The girls were pregnant, the village was angry, and he was losing control of his life. He spent sleepless nights, pacing back and forth in his small house, wondering how things had gone so wrong. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, something even more shocking happened. One evening, as Jide sat outside his small house thinking of how his once promising life had spiraled out of control, a knock on his door startled him. When he opened it, he saw Adana, the quietest girl in the class, standing nervously with tears in her eyes. "Sir, I need to talk to you," she whispered. Jide's heart sank. He knew what was coming. Adana stepped inside, her hands trembling. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes and said, "I am pregnant." Jide's head started spinning. He could barely hear Adana's voice over the pounding in his chest. How had it come to this? He remembered that night with Adana. It was after a long day at school. She had asked him for help with her homework, and they stayed late talking and laughing. One thing led to another, and now this. "I am so sorry, Adana," Jide said, but his words felt empty. Adana turned and left, leaving Jide standing in the darkness. The weight of everything was crashing down on him. More girls were pregnant, and he was sinking deeper into a nightmare. The next day, the village elders gathered again. This time, the meeting was not just a warning, it was a demand. They had heard about Adana, and now the situation was unbearable. Angry fathers wanted to drag Jide out of the village. Mothers wept in the streets, and the young men of the village who once looked up to Jide now scorned him. At the meeting, Chief Eze stood up and raised his hand to silence the crowd. "Enough!" he shouted. The crowd quieted, their eyes burning with anger as they glared at Jide. "We cannot ignore what has happened," Chief Eze said, his voice filled with disappointment. "Jide has brought shame to our village, but before we take drastic action, we must hear from him." All eyes turned to Jide, who stood nervously in the center of the circle. His hands shook and he could barely breathe as the silence pressed down on him. "What do you have to say for yourself, young man?" Chief Eze asked. Jide opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was overwhelmed by guilt, fear, and confusion. He looked at the faces of the villagers, some angry, some disappointed, and others sad. He saw Amaka standing in the back, her belly swollen, her face filled with the mixture of sorrow and regret. I don't know what to say," Jide finally whispered. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean for this to happen." "A mistake?" one of the fathers shouted. "You didn't make one mistake. You made many. Look at our daughters." The crowd erupted in shouts and accusations. Jide wanted to run, but his feet were frozen to the ground. Chief Eze raised his hand again, calling for silence. "We cannot let this go unpunished," Chief Eze said, his voice steady and firm. "Jide must face the consequences, but we are not savages. There will be no mob justice here." The villagers muttered among themselves, unsure of what would happen next. Chief Eze turned to Jide and said, "You will take responsibility for each of these girls and their children. You will stay here in this village until you've made amends of what you have done. Do you understand?" Jide nodded, his heart heavy. He didn't know how he could possibly take care of so many girls and children, but he knew there was no escape. But then, just as the meeting was about to end, an old woman stood up. She was bent with age, her hair silver and eyes sharp with wisdom. She had not spoken a word throughout the meeting, but now her voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "Wait," she said. "There is something more, something darker." The villagers turned to the old woman in confusion. "What do you mean, Mama?" Chief Eze asked. The old woman stepped forward, her cane tapping the ground as she walked. "There is a curse in this village, a curse that no one speaks of anymore, but it has been there for generations." Jide's eyes widened and a chill ran down his spine. He had heard rumors about the village being cursed, but he had never believed them. The old woman continued, "This curse, it traps young men like Jide. It makes them lose control. It makes them do things they would never normally do." The crowd gasped. Was this true? Could the curse be the reason for all that had happened? Jide looked at the old woman, his heart pounding. Could this curse be real? Or was she trying to save him from his mistakes? And if the curse was real, how could it be broken? And the villagers murmured in fear and disbelief. The old woman raised her hand and said, "There is only one way to break the curse, but it is dangerous, very dangerous." The crowd was frozen in fear as the old woman spoke of the curse. Her eyes, sharp with wisdom, locked on Jide, and she slowly began to explain. This curse, it is ancient. It latches onto young men with bright futures like you, Jide. It twists their minds, making them act against their will, and brings shame to the village. The villagers whispered to each other, uncertain of what to believe. Was the old woman telling the truth, or was she just trying to protect Jide from punishment? Jide stood in the center of the crowd, still shaking. Could this really be a curse? He didn't know what to think, but a part of him wanted to believe it. It would explain why he had acted the way he did. The guilt he had been carrying for months began to lift, but only slightly. Chief Eze frowned, clearly unsure whether to believe the old woman. "And how do you know about this curse?" he asked. The old woman turned slowly to face him. "Because it took my own son many years ago," she said, her voice thick with sorrow. He was like Jide, young, smart, full of life, but the curse destroyed him. He left the village in shame, never to be seen again. The villagers gasped, and silence fell over the crowd. The old woman looked back at Jide and said, "There is only one way to break this curse, but it is dangerous. It may cost Jide his life. We must leave this decision to him." Jide felt the weight of her words. Could he truly be cursed, or was she trying to save him from the punishment that awaited him? As the sun began to set, the villagers dispersed, unsure of what would happen next. Jide returned to his small house, his mind swirling with confusion and fear. He couldn't sleep, not knowing if the old woman had spoken the truth or if it was all just story to protect him. Late into the night, Jide had a soft knock on his door. His heart jumped and he quickly opened it. Standing there, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was the old woman. "Come with me," she whispered. Jide followed her, his heart racing as they moved through the silent village, away from the hut and toward the forest at the edge of the village. The air was cool and the sounds of the night creatures filled the silence. When they reached a small clearing, the old woman turned to Jide and spoke in a low voice. "There is no curse, Jide." Jide's eyes widened in shock. "What?" he whispered. "I made up the story," the old woman said, her voice steady but soft. "I had to protect you. The villagers, they were ready to punish you. I couldn't let them do that. You are not cursed, Jide. You made mistakes, but you don't deserve what they were planning to do to you." Jide's head spun. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or more frightened. "Then why did you tell them that story?" he asked. "Because it was the only way to buy you time," the old woman replied. "They won't be satisfied with just talk for long. You must leave, Jide. Before sunrise, you have to run away. If they find you here tomorrow, they will come for you and it will not end well." Jide's heart raced as her words sank in. "But where will I go?" The old woman took his hand and pressed something into his palm. It was a small pouch filled with coins and some food. "You must leave the village now, before they wake up. Head to the city. There you can start a new life. No one will know what happened here." Jide looked at the old woman, tears filling his eyes. "Why are you doing this for me?" The old woman smiled, her face softening with kindness. "Because I couldn't save my son, but I can save you." Jide nodded, his heart heavy with both gratitude and sorrow. He knew there was no other way. The village had already turned against him. Staying would mean facing the wrath of the people he had hurt. He didn't know what would happen to the girls he had wronged, but he hoped they would be taken care of. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, Jide turned and began to walk toward the path leading out of the village. His footsteps were quiet and his heart pounded with fear and uncertainty. The night seemed endless as he moved through the dark forest, away from the life he had known. Just before he disappeared into the shadows, Jide looked back at the village one last time. The memories of his time there flooded his mind. The laughter of the children, the smiles of the girls, the trust of the other people. But these memories were now tainted, and Jide knew he could never return. With a deep breath, he turned his back on the village and ran, faster and faster, disappearing into the night. The old woman watched him go, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. She knew that Jide would never forget what had happened, but she prayed that he would find a way to heal and make amends for his mistakes in another life. And so, Jide's story in the village of Oko came to an end, but for Jide, the journey was just beginning. as he ran towards an uncertain future, leaving behind a past that would haunt him forever.